Some doors should never be opened, but curiosity has always been my weakness. The funeral was 3 days ago, and I'm still finding pieces of my grandfather scattered throughout his house like fragments of a life I never really knew. Everyone said he was eccentric, a hermit who kept to himself after grandmother died. But standing in his basement now, surrounded by decades of accumulated silence, I'm beginning to understand that eccentric was just the word people used when they didn't. Want to say crazy? The musty air down here carries something more than age and neglect. There's a weight to it. A presence that makes my skin crawl and my breath catch in my throat. This isn't just another creepy basement story you'll scroll past on social media. This is something that will burrow into your mind and refuse to leave. Something that will make you question every shadow in your own home. The concrete walls seem to pulse with secrets, and every creak of the floorboards above sounds like footsteps of ghosts I'm not ready to meet. You think you've heard horror stories before, but what I found beneath my grandfather's house will redefine your understanding of fear itself. The stale air tastes of copper and something else, something organic and wrong that coats the back of my throat like a film I can't swallow away. There's a mockery in how normal everything appeared. From the outside, how the neighbors still wave and smile, completely unaware that hell might be lurking just beneath their feet. If you're watching this alone in the dark, you might want to turn on every light in your house, because after tonight, you'll never feel truly safe in the darkness again. Subscribe if you dare to follow me deeper into this nightmare, though. I warn you, some knowledge comes with a price that can never be repaid. What would you do if you found something that had been watching you your entire life? Something that knew your name before you even learned to speak it? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller. Tanita is a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. I'm curious about something else too. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your local time and location in the comments. There's something strangely comforting about knowing others are experiencing this darkness with me, scattered across the globe, but united in this moment of terror. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? It was while sorting through grandfather's belongings that I noticed the scratches on the basement floor, long, deliberate gouges in the concrete that seemed to form a pattern, leading toward what I initially thought was just another wall. The gouges were too deep, too uniform to be accidental damage, and when I knelt to examine them more closely, I realized they weren't just scratches, they were claw marks, and they led to a section of wall that sounded hollow when I tapped it. Behind that false wall, I found a trapdoor. And beneath that trapdoor lay a chamber that my grandfather had spent decades keeping secret. The smell that rose from below was indescribable, a mixture of decay, fear, and something alive that had been breathing the same stale air for far too long. As I descended into that hidden space with nothing but my phone's flashlight to guide me, the scratching sounds began, echoing from somewhere deeper in the darkness. And I realized that grandfather's secret wasn't dead and buried. It was very much alive, and it had been waiting for someone to find it. The cage dominated the hidden chamber like a monument to madness, its iron bars thick as my wrist and black with decades of rust that looked disturbingly like dried blood in the week. Light from my phone. This wasn't some hastily constructed prison. Every weld, every rivet, every reinforcement spoke of careful planning and desperate necessity, as if someone had built it knowing that whatever went inside would test every joint and seam until it found a weakness. Chains wrapped around the entire structure like metallic serpents, their links worn smooth by constant tension and movement. Secured with padlocks that belonged in a medieval dungeon rather than a suburban basement. The concrete floor around the cage was scarred with gouges that formed radiating patterns. Like something inside had spent years, maybe decades, clawing at anything within reach, wearing grooves into solid stone through sheer persistence and rage. But it was the ceiling that made my blood free. Scratches stretched across every inch of the low concrete above. Deep parallel lines that could only have been made by something tall enough to reach up while standing in the cage. Something with claws long enough to carve through solid concrete like soft clay. The pattern was methodical, almost artistic in its precision, covering the entire ceiling in a grid of destruction that must have taken years to complete. A testament to patience that no human could possess and no animal should survive long enough to achieve. The smell was stronger here, concentrated in this underground tomb, that organic wrongness mixed with something medicinal, It's like antiseptic over rotting meat, as if someone had tried to clean wounds that refused to heal. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness beyond my phone's reach, each drop echoing with a hollow sound that seemed to mock the rapid beating of my heart. And I realized that this chamber extended further than I could see, that the cage was just the beginning of grandfather's subterranean horror. Old stains covered the floor in dark patches that absorbed my flashlight beam instead of reflecting it. And I found myself grateful that the dim light couldn't reveal their true color, though my imagination filled in the details with nauseating accuracy. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, as if I were breathing through wet fabric. And every breath brought with it the taste of copper and decay that made my stomach churn and my head spin with revulsion. Tools hung on hooks along one wall, not the innocent implements of a home workshop, but specialized instruments whose purposes I couldn't identify and didn't want to contemplate, each one polished to a shine that spoke of regular use and careful maintenance. A wheelbarrow sat in one corner, its interior stained with the same dark patches that covered the floor. And beside it lay coils of rope, rolls of plastic sheeting, and containers filled with liquids that reflected my light like oil but moved with the consistency of something far more sinister. The cage door stood slightly ajar, held closed only by a single padlock that looked newer than the rest, its brass surface bright against the ancient iron. And I realized with growing horror that whatever lived in this prison was still here, still breathing somewhere in the darkness beyond my sight, waiting for me to come close enough to reveal itself. The journal was hidden behind a loose stone in the chamber wall, wrapped in oiled cloth like a relic too dangerous for casual discovery. Then when I opened it, grandfather's handwriting stared back at me with the desperate intensity of a man recording his own descent into hell. The early entries were neat, methodical, dated back to 1987 when he first inherited the house from his own father. But as the years progressed, the writing became increasingly frantic, the letters growing larger and more erratic, as if his hands shook with fear or exhaustion while he wrote. Keep it contained. Read the first entry, underlined 3 times with ink that had faded to the color of old blood. The feeding schedule is critically every 3 days. No exceptions, no delays, no matter the cost or consequences. Father tried to explain before he died, but some knowledge can only be learned through experience. And experience is a cruel teacher when the price of failure is measured in innocent lives. The pages were filled with dates, times, detailed notes about feeding methods and behavioral patterns, recorded with the obsessive precision of a scientist studying a specimen that could kill him if he made a single mistake. It grows stronger when hungry, one entry warned. The words scratched so deep into the paper that they tore through to the page beneath. Tried to extend feeding interval to 4 days, nearly lost control of the situation. The bars bent, the concrete cracked, and the sounds it made brought Mrs. Henderson from next door, asking questions I cannot answer. Must maintain the schedule. Must never let it go too long without sustenance. Must never forget that our family's safety depends on keeping it satisfied, but never comfortable. The handwriting grew worse with each passing year, degenerating from grandfather's careful script into something that looked more like the scratching of claws across paper. And the content became increasingly desperate as he documented escape attempts, behavioral changes, and what he called the growing intelligence. Behind those terrible eyes, it learns, he wrote in 2003, the words barely legible. Watches everything, remembers everything, adapts to every precaution I take. Sometimes I catch it staring at the ceiling, counting the scratches it made, as if calculating how much longer it needs to complete some pattern I cannot understand. Other entries detailed his attempts to research the family history, to understand how this responsibility had passed from generation to generation like a genetic disease, always finding new guardians when the old ones grew too weak or too careless to maintain their vigil. The final entries were dated just weeks before his death. Written in handwriting so shaky, it looked like a child's first attempts at writing. Filled with apologies to future generations and desperate instructions for whoever would inherit his burden? I tried to prepare you, the last entry read, but how do you explain to a grandson that his family has been keeping a monster in the basement for over a century? That this responsibility will consume your life just as it consumed mine, just as it consumed my father and his father before him. The feeding schedule is in the metal box beneath the stairs. Follow it exactly. Never deviate, never try to be clever or find shortcuts. Because this thing in the cage is older and smarter than any of us, and it has been waiting patiently for someone to make a mistake. The first time I saw it move, my mind refused to process what my eyes were recording. Like a camera trying to focus on something that existed in too many dimensions for human comprehension to contain. It was the breathing that gave it away, not the steady rhythm of sleep, but the deliberate, controlled inhalation of something pretending to rest while actually watching, waiting, calculating the exact moment to reveal itself to its new audience. The pale flesh that shifted in the darkness looked wrong in ways that made my brain ache. Skin that seemed to loosen some places and stretch too tight in others, as if whatever lived inside that body had never quite learned how to wear it properly. Its limbs were all wrong proportions, arms that reached too far, fingers that bent in directions that violated basic anatomy, legs that folded and unfolded like a spider's appendages. Each movement accompanied by the wet sound of joints that shouldn't exist moving in ways that shouldn't be possible. But it was the eyes that nearly broke my sanity. Twin points of reflected light that caught my phone's flashlight beam and threw it back with an intelligence that was definitely not human. Definitely not animal, but something else entirely. Something that had been studying human nature for decades from its iron prison and learning exactly how to use that knowledge against anyone foolish enough to get close. They tracked my movement with predatory focus, never blinking, never looking away. And in their depths, I saw recognition, not just awareness of my presence, but knowledge of who I was, what I represented, and why I had come to stand before its cage like every generation before me. The thing shifted position without making a sound, flesh sliding against metal with the silence of a professional predator. And I realized that every movement was calculated, choreographed, designed to reveal just enough of itself to inspire terror without showing me everything it was capable of becoming. Its breathing changed rhythm as I watched, becoming deeper, more deliberate. And I understood that it was tasting my scent, learning my fear, cataloging every detail of my reaction. For future reference, the pale flesh seemed to pulse with its own internal light, a sickly phosphorescence that made my eyes water and my stomach clench with revulsion. And I found myself counting its ribs through skin so translucent I could see the dark organs moving. Beneath, beating with a rhythm that didn't match any heart I had ever heard, its head turned toward me with mechanical precision, neck rotating further than human anatomy should allow. And when our eyes met through the bars, I felt something cold and alien touch the inside of my mind, probing, testing, measuring the strength of my will against its own terrible patience. The smile that spread across its face was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen, not because it was grotesque or inhuman, but because it was perfectly, terribly human, the smile of someone who had just recognized an old friend, someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive, someone who knew that everything was about to change in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. The family tree I found in grandfather's attic told a story written in disappearances, a genealogical record where entire branches simply ended without explanation. Names crossed out in red ink with dates that never included a cause of death. Every generation of our bloodline stretched back to the 1800s showed the same pattern: multiple children born, but only one surviving to inherit the family home. The others marked with simple notations like missing or departed unexpectedly, or the most chilling of all, taken. The records were meticulously maintained, passed down through decades of family historians who seemed desperate to document something they couldn't openly discuss, creating a coded language of loss that spoke volumes about the terrible responsibility each generation carried. Census records from the town library revealed even more disturbing details. The house had remained in our family for over 150 years, but the surrounding neighborhood showed an unusual pattern of turnover, families moving away after just a few years, property values staying mysteriously low despite the desirable location, and missing persons reports that clustered around our address like pins on a map, marking some invisible zone of danger. The newspaper archives were filled with stories that never quite connected the dots. Articles about missing hikers who were last seen near our street, runaway teenagers whose abandoned cars were found parked blocks from our house, and drifters who simply vanished from the local homeless shelter. Their belongings left behind as if they had stepped outside for a cigarette and never returned. One article from 1962 caught my attention. A young woman named Sarah Chen had disappeared while walking her dog past our house. Her pet found the next morning tied to our mailbox, whimpering and refusing to leave despite having no food or water, as if it knew its owner would eventually return from wherever she had gone. The police reports were filled with interviews of witnesses who described hearing strange sounds at night, scratching noises that seemed to come from underground, and crying that echoed from beneath the street as if someone were calling for help, from a place no rescue could reach. But the most disturbing discovery came in a box of photographs hidden in grandfather's bedroom closet pictures, spanning decades, showing the same basement chamber, the same iron cage, but with different people standing guard, different generations of our family posing beside their inherited burden like keepers at some hellish zoo. The faces changed, but the expression remained constant, a mixture of resignation, fear, and exhaustion that spoke of a responsibility that consumed everything else in their lives, turning ordinary people into reluctant wardens of something that should never have been allowed to exist. In the oldest photograph, dated 1923, I could make out my great-great-grandfather standing beside a much smaller cage, suggesting that whatever lived down there had been growing, evolving, becoming more dangerous with each passing decade, requiring stronger prisons and more desperate measures to keep it contained. The final photograph in the collection showed grandfather himself, taken just months before his death, and the change in his appearance was shocking. The man I remembered from my childhood had been transformed into something hollow and haunted, aged beyond his years by the weight of his secret, his eyes holding the same desperate exhaustion I had seen in every previous generation of guardians. The metal box beneath the stairs contained grandfather's feeding instructions, written in clinical detail that made my hands shake as I read through decades of carefully documented horror masquerading as routine maintenance. The schedule was precise, every 72 hours, no exceptions, with backup dates marked in red ink for emergencies. And the methodology was described with the detached professionalism of someone who had long ago stopped thinking of his actions as anything other than necessary survival. Fresh meat only, the instructions began. Never frozen, never processed, and never anything that has been dead longer than 24 hours, because it can smell the difference and refuses to eat anything that doesn't carry the essence of recent life. The feeding process required specific tools, a long-handled pole with a hook attachment, thick leather gloves that reached past the elbow, and a face mask soaked in vinegar to mask human scent, because the creature associated the smell of its keeper with feeding time and would become increasingly aggressive if it detected that familiar presence without receiving its expected meal. But the most horrifying revelation came in the detailed notes about procurement's grandfather hadn't been feeding it butcher shop meat or roadkill as I had desperately hoped, but something far worse, something that explained the missing persons reports and the carefully maintained relationships with the local homeless shelter and runaway services. The journal entries described a system of selection based on people who wouldn't be missed, individuals whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation, and the careful psychological manipulation required to lure them to the house under various pretenses, offers of work, promises of shelter, or simply the appearance of a harmless old man who needed help carrying groceries from his car. The feeding chamber extended beyond the cage into a series of smaller rooms that I hadn't yet explored, equipped with restraints and tools that grandfather euphemistically called preparation areas, where victims would be kept until the creatures' hunger reached its peak and their terror reached the perfect intensity that seemed necessary for the feeding process to succeed. The creature didn't just eat flesh, consumed fear, fed on desperation, and required its meals to be aware and terrified during the final moments, which explained the soundproofing that lined the walls and the careful scheduling that ensured no screams would reach the surface during daylight hours when neighbors might hear. Each feeding was documented with scientific precision: the victim's emotional state, their physical condition, the creature's response to different types of prey, and the length of time each meal would satisfy its hunger before the next feeding became necessary. The notes revealed that the creature's appetite was increasing with age, requiring larger meals more frequently, and that grandfather had been struggling to maintain the feeding schedule during his final months as his physical strength declined and his ability to procure suitable victims became increasingly difficult. The final entry in the feeding log was dated 6 days before grandfather's death, with a notation that sent ice through my veins. Next feeding overdue by 48 hours. Subject escaped during preparation phase, creature becoming increasingly agitated. An aggressive bars showing signs of stress fractures. Containment may not hold much longer. I realized that grandfather had died not from natural causes as everyone believed, but from the consequences of a missed feeding, and that the thing in the cage had been without food for over a week, growing hungrier and more desperate with each passing hour, waiting for someone to continue the cycle of horror that had sustained it for generations. The first time it spoke my name, I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, trying to convince myself that everything I had discovered was some elaborate hoax, some sick joke grandfather had constructed to torment his survivors from beyond the grave. Marcus, the voice drifted up from the darkness below, soft and melodious and perfectly human, except for the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off walls that shouldn't exist and penetrating my bones with vibrations that made my teeth ache. The sound of my own name spoken by that thing sent me stumbling backward into the kitchen, my rational mind insisting that I had imagined it. That stress and lack of sleep were creating auditory hallucinations, but deep in my gut I knew the truth. Had been listening to grandfather call my name during my childhood visits, storing the sound in whatever passed for its memory, waiting for the right moment to demonstrate just how much it knew about my life. When I finally gathered enough courage to return to the basement, it was waiting for me at the front of the cage, pressed against the bars like a child, eager to share secrets with a new friend. "You used to be afraid of the dark, Marcus," it whispered, its voice carrying the same gentle tone my mother had used to comfort me during thunderstorms, but twisted into something obscene by the knowledge that no mother's voice should possess. "You would cry for your nightlight when you visited grandfather, remember? Such a frightened little boy, always sensing something watching you from the shadows, always knowing that monsters were real, even when the adults told you otherwise." The creature's knowledge extended far beyond casual observation. It knew about the time I had wet myself during a camping trip. It's about my first crush in middle school, about the recurring nightmare where something with too many teeth chased me through endless corridors that looked suspiciously like grandfather's basement. It recited details from my life with the accuracy of someone who had been taking notes for decades, watching through cracks in the floorboards, listening to conversations, studying every aspect of my development with the patience of a predator, grooming its ultimate prey. But the most terrifying revelation came when it began speaking about things I had never told anyone. Private moments I had experienced alone, secret thoughts I had never voiced aloud, proving that its surveillance extended beyond mere physical observation into something far more invasive and impossible. It knew about the depression I had hidden from my family, the nights I had considered ending my own pain, the desperate loneliness that gnawed at me despite being surrounded by people who claimed to love me. And it spoke of these intimate vulnerabilities with the casual familiarity of someone who had been there during my darkest moments, feeding on my despair like a parasite drawing sustenance from my suffering. "Your grandfather tried to protect you from this knowledge," continued, its voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "But protection is just another form of cruelty when it prevents someone from understanding their true purpose. In life, you were never meant to live a normal existence, Marcusur. Bloodline carries responsibilities that transcend ordinary human concerns. And the sooner you accept what you are, the easier this transition will become for both of us." The way it spoke about our relationship, using terms like partnership and cooperation, made my skin crawl with the realization that it viewed me not as its next meal, but as something far worse its willing accomplice in whatever horrors lay ahead. The cage began to buckle on the 10th day after grandfather's death, metal groaning under pressure that should have been impossible for any living thing to generate, and I watched in horror as bars thick as my wrist bent outward like soft clay under the creature's increasingly desperate attempts at escape. The sound of tortured metal filled the basement at all hours now. A constant reminder that my hesitation to continue the feeding schedule was pushing the situation toward a catastrophe I wasn't prepared to handle. And each new crack in the concrete, foundations sent vibrations through the house that made picture frames rattle and doors swing open without explanation. It had stopped trying to communicate with words, replacing its seductive whispers with sounds that belonged to no earthly animal, howls that started too low for human ears to detect, and climbed to frequencies that made my sinuses burn and my vision blur, accompanied by a rhythmic pounding that matched my heartbeat as if it were trying to synchronize our biological functions in preparation for some terrible merger. The smell rising from the basement had changed too, becoming thick and cloying like overripe fruit mixed with industrial chemicals. A stench so intense that I had to breathe through my mouth to avoid vomiting, and even then the taste coated my tongue with a metallic residue that lingered for hours after I fled upstairs. Sleep became impossible as the sounds from below grew louder and more frantic. The creature throwing itself against the cage with such violence that the entire house shook. And I found myself lying awake at night wondering if the foundation would hold, or if I would wake up to find it standing at the foot of my bed, finally free to express its gratitude for my negligence. The neighbors began asking questions I couldn't answer. Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door 3 times in 1 week, claiming she heard construction noises at odd hours and asking if I was renovating the basement, while Mr. Peterson mentioned that his dog refused to walk past our house anymore, whimpering and pulling away whenever they approached our property line. Water pipes throughout the house began bursting without warning, flooding rooms with rusty liquid that stained everything it touched a deep crimson color. And the electrical system started failing in ways that made no sense to the repair technicians I called, who left shaking their heads and muttering about problems they had never encountered before. The creature's physical transformation accelerated with its growing desperation, its pale flesh darkening to a mottled gray that reminded me of corpse flesh in various stages of decay, while its limbs stretched and distorted until they no longer resembled anything that could be called human, becoming something more akin to the appendages of a deep-sea creature adapted for crushing and tearing. But it was the intelligence behind its eyes that terrified me most. The calculating patience had been replaced by a feral cunning that suggested it was no longer content to wait for me to make the right decision, that it was actively planning its own liberation regardless of my cooperation or consent. The scratches on the ceiling had begun forming new patterns, interconnected symbols that looked almost like writing in some alien alphabet. And I realized that its decades of scratching hadn't been random acts of frustration, but careful preparation for this moment, creating some kind of ritual circle that would aid in its escape when the time finally came. The missing persons files at the town library painted a picture of systematic predation that stretched back generations. A carefully maintained hunting ground where my family had been selecting victims with the methodical precision of a spider, tending its web. The librarian, Mrs. Kowalski, seemed relieved to finally have someone take an interest in the old records, mentioning that she had always found it strange how certain files kept disappearing from the archives only to reappear months later, fled incorrectly as if someone had been removing them for private study before returning them to avoid suspicion. The pattern became clear once I laid out the photographs. Chronologically missing persons reports clustered around our family's residence in predictable cycles, with disappearances increasing during the months when grandfather's journal indicated the creature's appetite was growing stronger. Sarah Chen, the young woman with the dog, it's been just the beginning. Her file led me to Michael Torres, a homeless veteran who vanished 3 days later, then to Patricia Williams, a runaway teenager whose parents had stopped looking for her after the police suggested she had probably moved to another city. Each case followed the same template: individuals with minimal social connections, people whose absence wouldn't generate sustained investigation, chosen with the careful consideration of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of invisible predation. The police reports contained details that made my stomach churn with recognition: witnesses describing screaming sounds that seemed to come from underground, strange smells emanating from storm drains near our house, and multiple reports of people claiming to hear crying or calling for help from beneath the pavement. always dismissed as urban legends or the overactive imaginations of stressed residents. Detective Morrison, now retired and living in a nursing home across town, agreed to meet with me after I explained my interest in the cold cases. And his memories painted an even darker picture of my family's involvement in the town's history of disappearances. "Your grandfather was always very cooperative with our investigations," he told me, his roomy eyes sharp with suspicion that had never faded despite decades of retirement. "Always quick to offer help, always had suggestions about where we might look for missing persons. Always seemed to know exactly which cases would go nowhere and which ones we might actually solve." The detective's files contained notes that never made it into the official reports. Observations about grandfather's behavior during questioning, inconsistencies in his alibis, and a growing suspicion that someone in town knew more about the disappearances than they were willing to admit. But the most damning evidence came in the form of a map the detective had kept private, marking the locations where missing persons were last seen, creating a pattern that radiated outward from our house like ripples in a pond, the highest concentration of disappearances occurring within a 6-block radius of our property. He had spent his entire career trying to prove what he couldn't quite articulate, that something evil lived in our neighborhood, something that required regular feeding to maintain its terrible existence, and that my family had been willing. Accomplices in a cycle of murder that spanned generations of innocent victims who trusted the wrong person at the worst possible moment. The creature's revelation about our bloodline connection came on the 14th night, delivered in a voice that had grown stronger and more confident as its physical prison weakened. And the truth it shared made me understand why every generation of my family had been trapped in this nightmare with no possibility of escape. "We are bound, Marcus," it whispered through the increasingly fragile bars, its words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Bound by blood and bone and promises made before your great-great-grandfather understood the true cost of his desperation." The story it told me stretched back to 1847, when my ancestor Thomas had made a bargain to save his dying wife from consumption, trading his family's future for her temporary reprieve from death, never realizing that some contracts extend beyond the grave and bind every subsequent generation to their terms. "Your bloodline carries my essence now," it explained, its pale flesh pulsing with that sickly inner light, which means that destroying me would be like cutting out your own heart possible, but fatal to everything you are and everyone who shares. "Your genetic legacy." The creature described the connection in terms that made my skin crawl, a symbiotic relationship where it fed on the fear and death my family provided, while in return granting us unusual longevity, enhanced intuition about danger, and an inexplicable ability to avoid the kind of random accidents and diseases that claimed most people. But the price of this protection was absolute compliance with the feeding schedule. Because the creature's hunger wasn't just for flesh and terror, it was consuming something essential from our family line, metaphysical energy that connected us across generations. And if that energy were cut off suddenly through starvation or rebellion, every living member of our bloodline would begin dying within days. The examples it provided were documented in grandfather's journals. Cousin Robert, who tried to burn down the house in 1983, found dead of a heart attack at age 28 despite perfect health, and my great-aunt Susan, who attempted to contact authorities about the basement, discovered in her apartment with no signs of violence or illness, simply dead, as if her soul had been suddenly withdrawn from her body. But it wasn't just death that awaited those who broke the covenant. It was something worse. A spiritual disconnection that left survivors feeling hollow and purposeless, unable to experience joy or love or any of the emotions that made life worth living, existing as empty shells that envied the dead their peaceful rest. The creature had been growing stronger with each generation of feeding, learning from each family member who served as its keeper, absorbing knowledge and memories that it stored like trophies in whatever passed for its consciousness, which meant that destroying it would also mean losing centuries of family history, genetic memories, ancestral wisdom that had been preserved within its alien intellect. "Your grandfather understood this toward the end," it continued, its voice taking on an almost paternal tone of disappointment. which is why he spent his final months trying to prepare you for this responsibility instead of seeking some foolish escape that would doom everyone you've ever loved to a fate worse than death. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a burial shroud, making me understand that I wasn't just dealing with a monster in my basement. I was facing a choice between personal freedom and the survival of everyone who shared my blood. A decision that would define not just my own fate, but the fate of cousins and siblings and future children, who would carry the consequences of my choice into whatever dark future awaited our cursed family line. The compulsion hit me like a physical force when I reached the county line, an invisible wall that made my hand shake uncontrollably on the steering wheel and filled my mouth with the taste of copper and decay until I was forced to pull over and vomit onto the roadside grass. I had packed everything important into my car during the night, planning to disappear before dawn and let whatever happened in that basement become someone else's problem. But as I drove away from town, the creature's influence stretched after me like chains I couldn't see, dragging me back through a connection I was only beginning to understand. The further I drove, the worse the symptoms became. My vision blurred until I could barely make out the road ahead. My heartbeat became irregular and painful, as if something were squeezing my chest from the inside, and every breath felt like drowning in thick liquid that tasted of fear and ancient hunger. Other drivers began honking and swerving around my car as I unconsciously slowed to a crawl, my body refusing to cooperate with my desperate desire to escape. And I realized that the creature hadn't been lying about our connection. I was tethered to it by something stronger than physical chains, bound by blood and genetics, and the accumulated weight of generations who had tried and failed to break free from their inherited curse. The radio in my car began picking up signals that shouldn't exist, whispered conversations in languages I didn't recognize, screaming that sounded like the voices from grandfather's feeding chamber, and underneath it all, the creature's voice, calling my name with increasing urgency as the distance between us grew beyond its comfort zone. My phone started behaving erratically, calling numbers I had never dialed, sending text messages I hadn't written, displaying photographs from grandfather's collection that I had never uploaded, as if the creature were using my own technology to remind me of what awaited me if I continued this futile attempt at escape. The worst part was the dreams that came when I tried to rest at a motel 50 miles from town, nightmares where I watched my sister collapse during her morning jog, my cousin's children developing mysterious illnesses that no doctor could diagnose, and my elderly aunt discovering lumps in her throat that grew larger with each passing hour I spent away from my responsibility. When I called my sister to check on her, she mentioned feeling dizzy and nauseous all morning, complaining of a metallic taste in her mouth and a strange burning sensation behind her eyes, symptoms that matched exactly what I was experiencing. As the creature's influence tested the limits of our connection, the realization that my family was suffering because of my cowardice made the decision for me. I couldn't live with the knowledge that my freedom had been purchased with their agony. Couldn't bear the thought that children who didn't even know about the creature's existence were paying the price for my rebellion against a system that had protected them for generations. The drive back to town felt like descending into hell, each mile bringing relief from the physical symptoms, but increasing the psychological weight of what I was accepting. And by the time I pulled into grandfather's driveway, I understood that I had never really had a choice in the first place. The creature had simply been patient enough to let me discover the truth for myself. The changes began the moment I returned to the house, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each day I delayed the inevitable feeding, as if the creature's proximity was accelerating some transformation that had been dormant in my genes for decades. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed eyes that were developing the same hollow, haunted look I had seen in grandfather's final photographs. Dark circles that seemed to deepen hourly, and a pale complexion that made me appear as if I were slowly bleeding out from some internal wound. My hands developed a tremor that made simple tasks like writing or eating nearly impossible, and I found myself unconsciously scratching at my arms until they were covered in angry red welts that formed patterns disturbingly similar to the marks on the basement walls. Sleep became a foreign concept as my dreams filled with visions of the creature's memories, decades of feeding sessions viewed through its eyes. The terror and desperation of countless victims experienced from the perspective of their predator. And worst of all, glimpses of my own future as I gradually became something that was no longer entirely human. The hunger was the most disturbing change. Starting as a vague dissatisfaction with normal food that progressed to a complete inability to keep anything down except raw meat. And even that provided only temporary relief from the gnawing emptiness that seemed to be consuming me from within. I caught myself staring at the neighbors with a calculating gaze that reminded me uncomfortably of the way grandfather used to watch people. Evaluating their social connections and vulnerability, mentally cataloging which ones might disappear. Without causing too much investigation, my hearing became unnaturally acute, picking up conversations through walls that should have been soundproof. And I found myself able to detect the emotional state of people around me through subtle changes in their scent that no human should be able to perceive. The creature's voice had become a constant presence in my head, no longer confined to the basement, but whispering suggestions and observations throughout my daily routine, offering helpful advice about which victims would be easiest to procure, and which feeding methods would provide the most satisfaction for both of us. Your grandfather fought these changes for years, it told me during one of our increasingly frequent mental conversations. But resistance only makes the transformation more painful and prolongs the inevitable acceptance of what you are becoming. The physical changes were harder to hide from casual observers. My teeth were becoming sharper and more pronounced. My fingernails grew at an unnatural rate despite frequent trimming, and my skin was developing a translucent quality that revealed the network of dark veins beneath, like a roadmap of corruption spreading through my body. But the psychological changes were far worse than any physical transformation, as I found myself experiencing moments of complete emotional disconnection, where other people seemed like nothing more than potential sources of sustenance. Hopes and fears and relationships reduced to abstract concepts that held no more meaning than the nutritional content of livestock. The truth about grandfather's death revealed itself through the creature's increasingly detailed confessions, shared with the casual intimacy of someone recounting a fond memory to an old friend. And the horror of what I learned made me understand that my hesitation to feed it wasn't just prolonging my own suffering. It was repeating the exact same mistake that had cost grandfather his life. He grew weak in his final months, the creature explained with something that almost sounded like sadness. Too frail to hunt effectively, too proud to ask for help from family members who didn't understand the burden he carried, and eventually, too desperate to maintain the careful selection process that had kept our activities invisible for so many decades. The feeding schedule had become irregular as grandfather's health declined, forcing him to take increasingly dangerous risks to procure suitable victims, and his final attempt at hunting had gone catastrophically wrong when his chosen target, a young homeless man named David, had fought back with unexpected strength and escaped into the night, with full knowledge of what grandfather had been planning to do to him. Your grandfather came to me that night covered in blood from wounds that wouldn't heal properly, the creature continued, its voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a treasured secret, begging me to accept a smaller meal to make do with whatever scraps he could provide. But you must understand that my hunger had grown beyond the point where such compromises were possible. The confrontation in the feeding chamber had been brief but decisive. Grandfather, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and the stress of maintaining his terrible routine, had simply lacked the physical strength to complete the feeding process when the creature's desperation reached its peak and it decided to take what it needed directly from its keeper rather than waiting for him to provide it through traditional means. He died knowing that he had failed in his primary responsibility, the creature told me with what I could only interpret as genuine remorse, but also with the understanding that his death would serve as a necessary lesson for whoever inherited his duties, that our relationship is built on mutual dependence, and breaking the terms of our agreement results in consequences that extend far beyond personal inconvenience. The physical evidence of grandfather's final moments was still visible in the feeding chamber bloodstains that were too extensive and too widely distributed to have come from any normal accident, scratches on the walls that suggested a desperate struggle, and most damning of all, fragments of fabric and personal items that belonged to grandfathers scattered around the cage. like the remains of a meal that had been consumed with unusual violence. But the creature's confession contained an even more disturbing revelation about the nature of grandfather's death. Hadn't simply killed him in a moment of hunger-driven desperation, but had been slowly draining his life force over a period of months, feeding on his vitality and memories until there was nothing left but an empty shell that collapsed when the final transfer was complete. This explained the rapid deterioration I had witnessed in grandfather's final years. It's the way he seemed to age decades in just a few months, and the hollow, distant look in his eyes that suggested he was seeing things the rest of us couldn't perceive, experiencing a reality that had been fundamentally altered by his prolonged contact with something that existed outside the normal boundaries of life and death. The ritual described in grandfather's final notes seemed like madness disguised as methodology, a desperate attempt to break free from generations of servitude through methods that violated every principle of safety and sanity that had kept our family's secret contained for over a century. The instructions were written in multiple hands, suggesting that several generations had contributed to this accumulated knowledge of how to destroy the creature, each adding their own discoveries and failures to create a comprehensive guide for what grandfather called the final solution to our inherited curse. The materials required were specific and disturbing iron blessed by 7 different faiths, salt that had been soaked in the tears of willing sacrifice, and most unnervingly, blood freely given by every living member of our bloodline collected during the darkest phase of the moon, when the creature's connection to our family was supposedly at its weakest point. The preparation took 3 days of fasting and ritual purification, during which I had to resist the creature's increasingly frantic attempts to dissuade me from my chosen course, its voice in my head becoming a constant stream of threats, promises, and desperate bargains that revealed just how much my decision terrified something that had never shown fear of anything in its century of captivity. The night of the confrontation, I descended into the basement, carrying grandfather's blessed weapons and wearing protection symbols carved into my own flesh, with a blade that had been consecrated according to instructions passed down through generations of failed attempts at liberation. The creature was waiting for me, no longer confined behind bars that had finally buckled under its desperate escape attempts. Its full form revealed for the first time as something that defied every natural law I thought I understood about biology and physics. It moved like liquid shadow given substance, flowing between solid and incorporeal states with the fluid grace of something that existed partially outside our dimension. And when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once, echoing off walls that seemed to bend and shift in response to its presence. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," it warned me as I began the ritual. Understanding me would require surrendering everything that makes you human, everything that separates your consciousness from mine, everything that your ancestors have died to preserve across generations of servitude and sacrifice. The battle that followed was unlike anything human beings were meant to experience, not just physical combat, but a war of wills and souls and fundamental concepts of reality, as the creature attempted to demonstrate why every previous generation had chosen servitude over the catastrophic consequences of rebellion. It showed me visions of what would happen if our connection were severed, violently cities consumed by plague, natural disasters that defied scientific explanation, and a spreading corruption that would turn our world into something resembling the hellish dimension from which it had originally emerged. But I pressed forward with the ritual anyway, driven by desperation and the accumulated rage of everyone who had died to feed its hunger, pouring the blessed salt in protective circles, and speaking words that felt like they were tearing my throat raw with each syllable. The creature's death scream shattered every window in the house and sent vibrations through the earth that registered on seismic equipment 3 counties away. But the silence that followed was somehow worse than any sound it had ever made. Hollow emptiness that seemed to suck all warmth and life from the air around me. The blessed weapons had done their work with terrible efficiency, reducing something that had terrorized my family for generations into a puddle of steaming ichor that ate through the concrete floor like acid, dissolving into the foundation of the house and carrying with it the last traces of our inherited curse. I felt the connection break like a chain snapping under tremendous pressure. A sudden liberation that flooded my system with relief so intense it brought me to my knees, gasping for air that suddenly tasted clean and free from the metallic taint that had plagued me since childhood visits to grandfather's house. Transformation that had been consuming me reversed itself within hours. My teeth returned to normal proportions. My skin regained its natural color, and the constant whisper in my head fell silent for the first time in weeks, leaving behind a peace I had never known was possible. But the celebration of freedom was short-lived, because within days of the creature's destruction, the consequences began manifesting exactly as it had warned they would. Starting with my immediate family and radiating outward to affect every person who shared even a trace of our corrupted bloodline. My sister called first, her voice weak and confused as she described symptoms that perfectly matched what grandfather's notes had predicted would follow: a violent severing of our supernatural connections, sudden onset anemia that no blood transfusion could correct, a wasting disease that consumed her from within, regardless of how much she ate, and worst of all, a growing certainty that something essential had been torn from her soul, leaving behind only emptiness where hope and joy had once resided. The doctors were baffled by the rapid deterioration affecting everyone in our extended family simultaneously, running tests that revealed nothing abnormal while their patients grew thinner and paler with each passing day, their life force draining away as if someone had pulled a plug that allowed their vitality to leak out into some invisible void. My cousin's children were the hardest to watch, bright and energetic kids who suddenly became listless and hollow-eyed, sitting motionless for hours while staring at nothing, their parents desperate for explanations that no medical professional could provide because the cause of their suffering existed outside the realm of scientific understanding. Within 2 weeks of the creature's death, I had attended 4 funerals and received calls about 6 more family members who were failing rapidly, despite the best efforts of specialists who couldn't identify any disease or condition that would explain their synchronized decline. The guilt was unbearable, knowing that my desire for freedom had condemned innocent people to a fate worse than the creature's original hunger. And as I watched my bloodline disappear one by one, I understood why every previous generation had chosen servitude over rebellion. Now I sit alone in this empty house, the last member of a family that chose death over compromise, and sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn, I think I can still hear something scratching at the walls, something that might be trying to claw its way back from whatever dimension my ritual banished it to. And I wonder if the price of freedom was worth the cost of everything I ever loved. If you're still listening to this story, if you've made it this far into the darkness with me, then maybe you understand why some doors should never be opened and some secrets should never be revealed. Subscribe if the silence frightens you, as much as it does me, because in a world without monsters, sometimes the absence of fear is the most terrifying thing of all.